para el expositor Hanger. En Pensilvania existen regulaciones excepcionales, ejemplo, estándares de emisión al aire, vertimientos. ¿Esas son especiales para los no convencionales de manera particular?
Generally, the answer is no, they're not special for shale gas. Most of the air rules in Pennsylvania, and I think this would be true across the U.S., are actually rooted in federal law, what we call the Clean Air Act, and apply not simply to shale gas development. Now, one important exception to that general statement would be the EPA rulemaking in April, where there are provisions within that rulemaking that address really unconventional or shale gas wells, especially the reduced emission completion requirements affect shale gas wells more than other forms of development. But generally, the rules on air are applicable in Pennsylvania and across the country, regardless of the kind of development, whether it's be shale gas or not.
Just to echo a bit, sorry, what John has said, the evolution of green completion rules is that it started at the state level. So Colorado and Wyoming first had them, then you have 5 or 6 other states, some of which require advance notice before there's venting and flaring. A lot of this took place in the Bakken because the capture and gathering infrastructure had not been built, and that's because you had a lot of operators in a lot of different plays. And so as they were drilling for tight oil, you had a lot of gas and nowhere to put it. You have a lot of ethane produced in the process and no way to capture or monetize that. So it took time. So the first level was the states imposed fines in order to create an economic incentive for producers to build that infrastructure. Then they put prohibitions on venting. So you can flare some, but let's not have venting at all. Some states prohibit it. And then the EPA followed in April, but that was after I think almost 9 states had put in state-level regulations to create some sort of system to incentivize the capture and minimization of venting and flaring.
Yeah, I think a little more explanation is warranted. In Pennsylvania and the U.S., we have problems with smog, which can be caused because of air pollutants from any number of industrial sources. We also have concerns about toxic air chemicals or toxic air pollutants, things like mercury, arsenic, lead. And those pollutants are generally regulated by federal law and have always been generally regulated by federal law. What David added was very helpful because it focused on some of the specific operational issues associated with oil and gas development, and his reference to the Bakken is really important in those terms. So again, in the U.S., you have this cooperation, ideally, between the federal government and state governments to, in fact, limit the impact on the air resource from oil and gas production, as well as other industrial sources and transportation sources that can cause smoggy, dirty air and other public health concerns.
Buenas tardes. Esta pregunta es para el señor Hanger y la señora Motz. Quieren saber si específicamente o cuáles son específicamente las áreas en que se prohíbe el desarrollo de las actividades de exploración y o explotación de este tipo de hidrocarburos.
In the U.S., it's somewhat decided on a federal level, but also decided on a state level. So, for example, I can't talk and hear myself talking at the same time. Anyway, so an example would be a national park. So, and the United States has protected areas of various kinds. National parks are one, wilderness areas are another, national monuments are another, and each of them has their own federal protections under law. And national parks are generally not open to oil and gas development. Wilderness areas are generally not open also, and that's because you're not allowed to have basically equipment in a wilderness area. You wouldn't be able to have a drill rig in it. So those are some areas. And then on the state and local area, certain areas can prohibit oil and gas development. But one of the controversies lately in Colorado is some of the local governments want to prohibit oil and gas development, not necessarily conventional, within the city. And there's been fights between the state government and the local governments, the city or county governments, over whether or not the city or the county has a right to do that. And it's still not decided. We have our state government suing one of our cities, saying you're not allowed to prevent development or even control development.
I think it was implicit in your question, but it's worth explaining that in the United States, the private landowner owns the mineral resources. So unless it is prohibited by state or by municipality or by some zoning rule, every person who owns land has the ability to put a well, as they do in Texas, in their backyard and produce that, unless, and they may have to comply with some rules. So it's allowed unless expressly prohibited. On federal lands managed by the Bureau of Land Management, it's prohibited unless expressly allowed, and they map out certain areas that are open for licensing from time to time and have rules that apply to them. The disadvantage our private system has is that it makes it very difficult to coordinate and optimize infrastructure, because as I think David alluded to earlier, you start off and everybody has their own truck and their own road and their own water disposal system, which is a huge burden. As a government, when you are licensing an area, you have the ability to optimize that infrastructure and dramatically reduce the footprint, and that's a great advantage that governments like yours have, which we don't have the authority for in the U.S., and I don't think we even have the authority at the state level to impose those sort of coordination requirements on private landowners.
Muchas gracias. La siguiente pregunta para los tres también. Los estudios de línea base de agua son necesarios antes de la exploración o solo antes de la explotación. ¿Pueden ser esos estudios hechos en paralelo con la exploración?
Well, I think I understand the question. There is a difference, in my view, between what a government wisely would do before doing exploratory wells versus what a government would do before full commercial production. I think those are two different situations. And I think having some baseline testing and even monitoring of an exploratory well makes sense. But I do not think having huge sets of rules about handling all of the water and the whole set of rules you would want in place for full commercial production as a requirement before you do exploration would make sense. So some common sense distinction between the two situations is in order, and you do have an opportunity to not only learn about the resource and how good it is and the economics of the resource, but you can, through some wise testing ahead of time and monitoring after effect, learn some further information that would be useful in planning for full commercial development. I'm sure you want to talk about that one.
I'll add something to that, and I'm not a water expert, so I'm learning as much as everyone else is here this week. I guess one of the questions I would ask, though, is are there things that you would discover in doing a baseline water sampling that would, when you analyze those, make you decide that you really don't want to develop in an area because you don't have a particular, if you were going to depend on groundwater for your fracking operations, you might find that you don't have a suitable kind of groundwater. And so therefore, why do all of the disturbance that's necessary for exploration? So, but, you know, if the disturbance involved in the exploration is relatively limited, then you might want to do that first and then go on to the baseline. But then it's a question of timing too. You can't go from exploration quickly to development if you haven't done the baseline studies already. So it might be a good idea to either start them ahead of time or do them in concert with the exploration.
Gracias. Para el expositor Hanger, ¿podría hablarnos más en detalle de la categoría de agua, de los estándares de desempeño en IGDE?
I can give you a little bit more information, but I'm not allowed right now to reveal the content specifically of the standards. IGDE will, I think, soon be having a formal announcement and a formal release of the information. But the water standards are I think 8 in total out of the 15, and they cover issues like what to do with the water when it comes back up. So what kind of standard must be met in order to be truly excellent when you have that water. There's a standard that deals with disposal of the water. There's a standard that deals with recycling and other things like that. So they are, I think, thorough, and they cover a lot of important issues. Certainly within the U.S. context, that would be true. But they're not comprehensive, meaning they don't cover every possible issue that you might want to ultimately address. And I believe IGDE will be doing more standard development in the future. But it's an excellent start, and I think is a good definition of what excellence in operation around the water issues really would look like.
Gracias. Esta pregunta también es para el expositor Hanger. Es en el marco de lo que él mencionó, de para no ir muy rápido o muy despacio en el desarrollo e implementación de estos modelos productivos, ¿cuáles serían aquellos aspectos mínimos que ya se deben cumplir o se deben tener antes de entrar en un escenario de producción?
Well, you do need a system, obviously, for licensing and the initial resource, and then permitting, I think, individual wells. Those two things are minimums that need to be in place, the licensing of the whole resource area, then the permitting of individual wells. I think you also need some clear rules that are understood by all participants in the industry and also the public that protect essentially land, water, and air. Those three areas need to be addressed in some fashion in the rules. And then I think you have to have credibility in the regulatory agency, so you have to look at the capacity of the regulatory agency, you have to look at the the resources available to the agency, the staffing levels, I think, again, are critical there. Training that may be necessary, that can be identified essentially now and provided so that you're ready for when production starts. Those would be the basic minimums that I think a regulatory regime should have in place before getting going. You know, I want to be careful in saying how quickly you can do that in Colombia. In the U.S., I think it's reasonable to say we're a state starting from scratch, and virtually most states are not starting from scratch in the U.S. They have had oil and gas development. So they have a regulatory agency and they have an oil and gas program. They're not starting from scratch. But were you starting from scratch in the U.S., that would probably take about, at a minimum, a year to accomplish in most places if you were going fast. You know, if you were moving the regulatory process along, it would probably take a minimum of a year in the U.S. to get that done if you were starting from scratch. And that's a pretty aggressive schedule probably, but I think it's possible to do that in the U.S. in that time period.
Just to add a point, I agree with everything John said. You've got to have, I'd add maybe disclosure to that list as well. You need a well construction plan. You need a plan for how you're going to manage flow back waters. But the environmental impact assessment system gives you a guide, because you have your first order issues, which are issues relevant to exploration. So you might have an environmental impact assessment for the exploration phase. So that might say there's 2 wells, it's in this area, and that will tell you whether or not you've got a biodiversity issue, or you've got some sort of a local issue that you've got to address and mitigate. Then the second order issues are the development stage issues. That's where you have more wells and more water, and that's where you'll deal with the access issues. So those are going to tell you what issues you need to contend with before you let the next phase develop. And because the geology will differ, and the neighborhoods will differ, and you may have dense population areas in some areas, and sensitive, tropical forest in another, you'll have to be guided by that, because one set of rules in advance won't tell you what you need to do in order to implement that license. So I think you've got the 50,000-foot framework, and you've got the environmental impact assessment, and those are the 2 things I think that give you the guide to what to do in the exploration phase.
Muchas gracias. Esta pregunta es para el Dr. John Hanger. La industria petrolera en Colombia está manejando gran cantidad de agua para inyección. Esto es de recuperación secundaria. Y la disposición de agua, la mayoría de campos convencionales tienen alta producción de agua. En este contexto, ¿puede usted compartir algunas de las ideas para usar las reglas que están en este momento para no convencionales y cómo poder lidiar con los temas relacionados con agua?
Yes. I think the first issue you have to decide is in terms of the disposing of drilling wastewater, are you going to allow it to be discharged to rivers and streams or not? I personally feel at this point the answer should be no. And I believe the technology allows the answer to be no. I want to be careful. There may be some exceptions that are justified around the world. I could be persuaded that what I've just said in a particular circumstance isn't actually required. But I believe that you start with an answer of, no, we're not going to allow drilling wastewater to be discharged to rivers and streams. Then you have to get to questions like, well, what's going to happen with it? Well, I think reuse and recycling technology is certainly part of the answer, though it's not a full answer. David Yacimientos had information in his presentation about some of the treatment options that are available. You can actually turn drilling wastewater, even the most highly polluted drilling wastewater, into distilled water. I mean, you can really get the salt levels down to the equivalent of fresh water, and as well as the other contaminants that are in drilling wastewater. There's technology that exists today to do that. There's a company in Pennsylvania that can do that, and that technology is not unique to that company. So there is a treatment that's possible to deal with what is very contaminated drilling wastewater. In the U.S., a lot of the ultimate disposal of water that is not either fully treated or recycled, it goes to these deep underground injection wells. And obviously there's been a lot of discussion in this conference about those wells. Again, I think that's a reasonable means of ultimately disposing of drilling wastewater, as long as the siting of those facilities is appropriate and the regulation of those facilities appropriate. I think that at this point in our development can be part of the answer. There's some characteristics in the geology, however, that is necessary in order to have an appropriate deep underground injection site. It turns out that Pennsylvania actually doesn't have a lot of probably places where it's appropriate to do deep underground injection, but there are other parts of the U.S., including states that border Pennsylvania, where there's appropriate geology for that use. So I think it's a mixture of recycling, treatment, including potentially full treatment, and deep underground injection, with a basic answer that we're not going to allow the discharge of the polluted drilling wastewater to rivers and streams.
I just wanted to add something. We were talking at the break and we didn't have a chance to finish the discussion, so I wasn't sure what the context was, but we were talking about using water produced in oil and gas wells for other purposes. And I don't know if you have coal bed methane development, and that some of the water that you're talking about is produced water from coal bed methane. But in the U.S., in Colorado and the Intermountain West, we have a lot of coal bed methane, and we have a gradient of quality of water produced from that. Some of it in southern Colorado is terrible, and you wouldn't want there's no question about using it for anything, and it's all injected. As you go up north, the quality of the water gets better and better, and there has been some use of it for roads or livestock or that sort of thing. And it's a bit controversial because there are some problems with using it on, some of it on crops, and they've used some that's not quite good enough quality and caused some problems with crops and livestock. So if it's a question of using coal bed methane water, there might be a possibility for it. And since I've got the microphone, I'd like to ask John, is it that Pennsylvania has chosen not to do deep water or deep injection of water, or that they don't have the geology to do it? It seems a little odd that you'd be shipping all of your water across the border to Ohio.
It's that we don't have the geology. It's not a choice. In fact, I think we would welcome more sites in Pennsylvania. At least I would welcome that as an opportunity, but the geology is not the best. There's some, and the companies actually look for it pretty aggressively because it remains an attractive disposal option economically, especially if you can have that disposal option close to where the water is being generated to cut down on trucking distances. But right now, there aren't suitable sites in Pennsylvania because of geology, and it's not a matter of political choice.
Gracias. Esta pregunta es abierta. ¿Qué aportes dan las universidades a las actividades de control ambiental en el desarrollo de los yacimientos no convencionales y cómo se vinculan al proceso?
It depends a lot on the university. So the University of Colorado, we have a lot of different departments. The law department engages a bit on the policy end in terms of regulations, but we don't get involved in the technology end. But the one study that I mentioned, the sustainability study looking at air and water, the engineering departments of the universities are studying that. And they don't generally get funding from the state governments, but they might get funding from the federal government or private foundations, that sort of thing, in order to fund their research. But university entities like the Colorado School of Mines and a little bit Colorado State University are very involved. And it's pretty much independent research, peer-reviewed reports, and then part of the problem, part of the issue has been, well, what happens to that? Does the technology get commercialized? Is there an extra step that could make things more available and get them into the production? And I'm actually not sure about the answer to that.
Just because we've been, Dave Yockstrom and I have been traveling the world with Will Fleckenstein from Colorado School of Mines. We've got a little introduction to this, but at least mines, but I would say Texas A&M is another example, and Oklahoma State University get a lot of money for research. Mines at least allows its PhD students and even its professors to own a share of the patents for the technologies that they invent. And then Mines owns the patents as well, and that it helps support the schools. So they've done a lot on reservoir imaging, on well completion, on some of the environmentally friendly technologies. And so they're very deeply into the technology of well completion in particular, and it's a way to attract the students and to retain the professors that they get to invent, they get funded, and then they get, both the university and the professor get to keep a share of that when it becomes commercialized.
Gracias. Esta es una pregunta abierta también. Parten diciendo que Colombia tiene una deficiente línea base ambiental en diferentes aspectos, desde hidrogeología, ecosistemas e incluso temas sociales. Y quisiera pedirles a cada uno una recomendación específica hacia el gobierno y una recomendación específica hacia las compañías que están llegando a Colombia basados en esa pobre línea base sobre esos diferentes aspectos.
I'll take a stab at that. I would say it would behoove the companies to adopt their own voluntary code of conduct, which would telegraph to consumers how they would conduct operations, a position on disclosure, a position on baseline testing, a position on community engagement, maybe some concept or at least a commitment to maximizing recycling and issues like that. So I think that would be a way for them to demonstrate their commitment, even though they may be in the very early stages of exploration or planning. And on the part of the government, you all are engaged in a terrific effort here. I think 3 or 4 things that I've seen other governments do that are useful. One is to talk about at least the aspirational goals for how the system will change on some of these same issues, disclosure, testing, inspection. Second would be to invest in capacity building along the lines that John Hanger said. Plan now for the people you'll need in 3 years. Third, I think for both companies and for the regulators, is to take some workshops like this into the community, the places, the license areas, and explain the technology to those people so they understand what's possible. And then maybe to promulgate some rules that reflect some of these best practices, maybe on an interim basis for the first order issues, for the exploration issues, and then take your time as you learn about your geology and whether your perspective for ultimate rules and for the second order issues on development. I think that would show the country where you're headed. It would recognize the areas, as you pointed out, where there are gaps, and at least make a commitment on the part of the government and companies to address the gaps. That would put you, frankly, at the head of the class compared to lots of other countries and lots of other jurisdictions in terms of saying at the outset, this is where we want to go.
Well, a couple. In terms of the companies, I think you have the advantage that you're going to be dealing with a relatively small number, or at least companies that are going to have a license to drill. And I think the companies that you're likely to be dealing with are some of the bigger ones or very biggest ones in the world. So I think those companies have resources to really prove to you that they're going to do the very best work in Colombia. That when it comes to all of these issues that we've been talking about, I think the companies that you're going to be dealing with have the technology, have the individuals, the management that allows them to really be excellent and have that culture of safety. And I think it's really up to them to demonstrate in concrete ways that that talk is something that they will walk in Colombia. And so I'd put them to the test because I think they'll meet the test. In terms of the government, I think two things. I think you can identify issues that are pretty well universal wherever you do oil or gas development, environmental issues that are pretty well universal. You know you're going to have flow back water and produced water. What are you going to do with it? Everybody has to address that. And I really think you're in a position with those kind of universal issues where you don't have to, what we call in the US, reinvent the wheel. You've got models to look at, good models to look at. Then there may be some issues, environmental issues, that are really specific and unique to Colombia because of the unique resource that Colombia has, a biodiversity issue perhaps, or some other issue. And there you may need to customize some rules, customize some practices. So identifying ahead of time which issues are kind of universal and which ones are specific to the Colombian experience and circumstance. And I think it's important, and I think you're going to find that more of the issues are in the universal category, and that fewer of the issues are in what I would call the uniquely Colombian category. Last point, and now I'm treading into some place that perhaps I shouldn't go, but I'm going to say it. I think it's very important that all Colombians benefit from this. And I feel that way about the US, and I think in some cases we haven't done that in the US. I frankly don't think Pennsylvania's done a good job of making sure that all Pennsylvanians have benefited from the shale gas development in Pennsylvania, so I can point at myself and my government. Those are issues of taxation and distributing the benefits to Pennsylvanians. So I think you have an opportunity to make sure that this is a real benefit to the people of Colombia, their education perhaps, or things that you know that are really important to the development of your country and your people.
I'd just like to add one more comment in terms of baseline, and I think John's right in putting it in terms of what the sort of the standard things are versus what are the special things that might apply to Colombia particularly. But in terms of those special things, I think part of it is, or a big part of it is sitting down with the people who know something specific about Colombia and asking yourselves, knowing what potential impacts might be, or knowing what potential in general impacts might be in terms of water or land disturbance or whatever. What do you need to know in order to evaluate whether there is an impact that you can live with or not? I'll talk a little bit tomorrow about impact analysis, and none of it is a go or no-go because we identify a particular impact. It's an evaluating, if you are going to have this kind of an impact, do you still want to do the project? And it's a political, a social decision, and if a lot of people are going to benefit from it, you may decide to do it. So you have to decide on what your baseline studies are going to be based on what you already know about the resources in your country and what you think are important. And when I say what you think, that includes people in the government, in the environmental or the mining division, but it also includes the people that that may either benefit or be harmed by the development. So they would have an opinion as well on what needs to be done in terms of baseline. And we have done plus or minus a good job of doing that in the U.S. as well.
Muchas gracias. Esta pregunta está relacionada con otras que ya se han hecho, lo aborda un poquito diferente. Con relación al intervalo de aprendizaje que mencionaba el doctor Godwin de los países que están iniciando como Colombia, hemos visto el trayecto de Estados Unidos en especial en la formulación y la implementación de la regulación de las mejores prácticas, como el completamiento verde o el transporte de agua por tubería, etcétera. Para el caso de proyectos piloto en la etapa inicial en que se encontraría Colombia, ¿cuáles serían los temas esenciales para abordar en la regulación y cuáles se dejarían para más adelante?
Well, there aren't, it's unusual. There are a number of countries where they're thinking about shale gas, but they actually didn't get to the point of doing a pilot project. So I would put France and Romania and Bulgaria in that category. And then you have countries where they're in the early stages of shale gas development. Canada, maybe not so early. Canada's more mature. Poland would be another one where you have some early drills, and the United Kingdom. I think of all of these, the United Kingdom probably provides the best guide. They've got one well. You've heard about their experience with Quadrilla, but their onshore oil and gas association, UKOOG, at the request of the government, looked at what's the framework for the regulations that we need to have in place before we go forward on gas. And the issues they picked were the ones that we've talked about today: disclosure, wellbore integrity, water management, seismic assessment, methane emissions, community impact, fugitive emissions, which are emissions which come from the rest of the transportation process, and other issues relating to the license to operate. I think that pretty much is the agenda. How granular you get or they get really has to do with what stage of development you're at, but that's the agenda. The European countries are in a slightly different position, those who are members of the European Union, because the European Union has many regulations or directives in place on, like their Natura directive, which talks about preservation of areas that are ecologically sensitive. They have a water directive, which talks about what you can put into waterways and what you have to disclose, and then they have their emissions targets. So the debate in Europe right now is whether this large, complex set of regulations that they have in place are sufficient, or whether they need to do something else. And there's a great deal of study, but not a lot of new rulemaking going on. The one thing they have decided is that countries are better at managing their own drilling and completion and geology than the European Union is, because they just don't have the expertise, and so much of that is local. So that's kind of a long answer, but I think the pilot countries are looking at this agenda, and before they go into the exploration phase, they're trying to have something in place on each of these issues.
Well, I'm going to provide a little different answer, I think. I personally think on exploration or pilot projects, the mistake that gets made is not moving pretty darn quickly. I think you need to do it. Now, when I say that, I'm assuming we're talking about a small number of wells. 5 to 10, 15, 20, a small number of wells. And I want to be clear about that. Now, frankly, this is gas, and if gas gets in the wrong place, it's not does nowhere near the same damage as oil getting in the wrong place. It's a much more forgiving resource than oil in terms of environmental impact on water or anything else. I mean, if the Macondo, the BP Gulf blowout had been a gas well and only a gas well, 11 workers would have died, and that's tragic and horrible. but the impact on the Gulf of Mexico environmentally would have been very, very limited, very limited. It was because it was an oil well that got out of control that the impact was devastating. So I think the mistake on pilot projects and exploration is not doing it. And I don't think you need all the rules in place at all in order to do the pilot project and exploration. Yeah, you don't want to put a well in an ecologically sensitive place when you're putting the first wells in. You know, if there's an endangered species known in the area, stay away from that. There's no need to put the first exploratory well right on an endangered species habitat. But I think France and Bulgaria and Romania have made a big mistake for that country, big mistake for the global environment. Let's remember again, if we're not using gas, what are we using? And the answer is coal and oil. Every day we don't develop this resource, more damage is done to the climate. I'm very concerned about climate, it's probably coming through to you. More damage is done to the climate every day we don't use this resource. So I think I would urge moving on exploration and pilot projects rapidly, and at the same time, do what Catherine and others have said, move forward with preparing the regulatory agencies, move forward with beginning serious work on all of the rules and regulations that must be in place before you go to full commercial development. I think you can do those two things on separate tracks.
One other thing that we recommended in Ukraine was we didn't have the opportunity to look very, very carefully at their regulations. We could only look at their laws and just dip into their regulatory scheme a little bit. But one thing we recommended was that they have a very active international oil community there, and a American Chamber of Commerce, and some environmental groups that are very concerned about what's happening. And we suggested that they sit down with that group, not working directly with the oil companies on an individual basis, but working with oil companies in general, working with the Chamber of Commerce, working with the environmental groups, and talk about what the regulations of the country were and whether they were suitable. We did the high-level law analysis, but we weren't capable of looking at the regulations, especially. So you might want someone from a different place to help guide that process. But just sitting down and having people talk together and seeing if there can be some consensus on what should be the standards for doing certain aspects of development in the country. So that might get you started on changing some regulations.
Gracias. Una pregunta también abierta. ¿Qué piensan sobre el trabajo conjunto entre reguladores e industria?
Well, I'm sure we all have a perspective. I'll keep my answer short so that let David and Catherine jump in on this one. Look, it's summed up in my view by the requirement that the regulators be professional and independent, that that means working and being available to all who have concerns, and that certainly includes the industry. Regulators need to interact with industry, but they must also interact with others that have concerns. The regulators must always approach everyone they deal with as neither friend nor foe. You know, they're the referee in the soccer game. You know, they're not to take sides in a sense. They want a good game. They want great play, and they want the rules followed. So if a regulator is doing that, then I think they're doing their job, and that certainly does include talking to the industry, involving the industry as well as others.
I would say in this area that consultation, close consultation between the regulator and industry is essential. If you look at the places around the world where regulation works well, I would say the UK is one example, Norway is another good example. There's a close relationship. There's no question the regulator is in charge, but they talk about their goals, they hear the plans of the company, they test whether or not they really are using the best technology, and then they issue the rule. They don't make silly mistakes because they've at least consulted on what's practical and what the cost implications are. And it's not hostile, and they always raise the bar because the next time they come in, there's another conversation about, is this the best you can do? That's where it works really well. You know, the US system is very much a compliance system. Set the bar, penalize and enforce, you know, and it hasn't worked so well. We don't have continuous improvement. We want it, but we don't really have it. So I think that's important, and even in our system, this green completions rule we talked about earlier, where the EPA put out a rule on how to minimize this venting and flaring, they consulted privately with the industry, which said, here's the time we need, here's what we can do now, here's what we can do in a little bit. They consulted on a rule, and then they put it out, and we had one of the toughest rules we'd had on the shale gas industry with absolutely no political flack in the middle of a presidential campaign. So I think it can work well. You got to have the expertise in the regulator. John's right, independent and capable and professional, but if you try and do it without that close consultation, it's just a recipe for making mistakes, I think.
John talked a little bit about the rulemaking process in Pennsylvania. The Colorado, and you'll hear a lot more maybe about the Colorado rulemaking process tomorrow when Dave Neslin gets on the line on the teleconference. But basically, Colorado really revamped its oil and gas regulations a couple of years ago after a new law in Colorado said basically that the agency that regulates oil and gas has to consider the impacts of oil and gas development on wildlife. The agency sort of ran with that, and to some people's dismay, and said, okay, well, we'll look more generally at our rules. So they looked a little bit more widely than some people thought they should have with the mandate to look at impacts of wildlife or consider impacts of wildlife. But anyway, the process that they used included a lot of what they called stakeholder meetings. So everyone was invited to participate. So it wasn't just the agency dealing with industry and asking industry's opinions. I mean, that would have never flown. But they had work groups where different people got into policy groups and enforcement groups and wildlife groups and other issue groups and talked about it and looked at what kind of baseline information there was, what was needed, what was working well, what wasn't. And then those groups recommended rules. The rules were debated. Then they got into a much more formal hearings process where they were giving testimony and the lawyers were getting up there and producing documents, and everything was very formal, but it started with the more informal process. And I don't know how your rulemaking process works, but if you don't have that informal process as part of your rulemaking, maybe that would be a place to start. Currently, that process is continuing in Colorado. In one sense, there were a few rules that they didn't get around to adopting. One was setbacks of drilling operations from houses and schools and other structures. That was one issue that wasn't finalized. And then another issue that wasn't finalized was what to do in terms of groundwater sampling. The issue regarding setbacks from structures, they've had a several-month process where they've had these stakeholder meetings and they've discussed it and come to understanding between the environmental groups and industry and the agencies. And the process is going pretty well, and they're about to finalize a rule. On groundwater, for various reasons, they decided we're not going to have stakeholder processes. We're going to propose a rule, we're going to have a hearing, we're going to have another hearing, and we're going to finalize the rule. And people are up in arms. And so we're not, it sometimes works well, sometimes works differently. You don't always get a final result, but, well, you always do get a final result, and it's the result that the agency is willing to finalize, and the commission or whatever the rulemaking body is willing to go with. But it's just a couple ways of doing things, and we think I think the stakeholder process helps a lot.
Muchas gracias. Tenemos máximo para 2 preguntas del público adicionales que quisieran hacer. Bueno, muchas gracias al doctor Hanger, a la doctora Catherine Matz y al doctor Gowin por esta sesión de preguntas y respuestas.
Of questions and answers.